Welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by the Institute of Navigation titled Detecting GNSS Jamming and Spoofing on Android Devices. Today's webinar is being presented by one of the paper's authors, Dennis Akos. Dennis completed a PhD degree in electrical engineering at Ohio University within the Avionics Engineering Center. He has since served as a faculty member with Luleå Technical University in Sweden, and then as a researcher with the GPS laboratory at Stanford University. Currently, he's a faculty member with the Aerospace Engineering Sciences Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. You can download this paper and many more on the Navigation Open Access website at navi.ion.org. The site has tools that allow you to read, download, cite, and share valuable research content such as this paper and many others. So thank you for being here, and now we'll turn it over to Dennis.
Thanks, Rick. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's great. Appreciate everybody's interest in the topic. I appreciate the opportunity from the Institute of Navigation to give this. Really, what we're talking about here is, there we go. This is a paper myself and my group here at University of Colorado Boulder published, looking at detecting jamming and spoofing on Android devices. I have to give a lot of credit to my co-authors, Nick Spence, DK Lee, Phil Davinsky, as well as those, Damian Morales in particular. A lot of people have done a lot of work on Android within my group, and it's been quite an interesting path. So my hope today is to give a little bit of background on what we talked about in the paper. Again, the work is a little bit older. We're kind of continuing it, but to highlight some of the different pieces. For those of you who don't know me, again, Rick, you gave a great intro. So I've got some goofy pictures from my college days when working with some dish antennas, everything else. But really, I'm an electrical engineer, computer scientist, working in an aerospace engineering department. Really have done GPS, software-defined radio, signal processing, RF design for a long time. Started some of the first software radio work, both on an academic path as well as a commercial path. And I've been at CU since about 2005, and I continue to work with the Stanford GPS lab as well. Really like to do experimental, tested, laboratory-focused kind of work. So, outline for today, basically, introduction, background. You know, some audiences I talked to GPS, GNSS. This time I'm going to just go to the path for the integration to the mobile phone platform. Talk about PNT information from Android. Why are we looking at Android? And then the idea of Android raw measurements, if you're not familiar with that. And then finally, I'll get to the problem, the critical nature of GPS, GNSS, and then the idea of radio frequency interference and spoofing. And then I'll talk to GNSSAlarm, and that is a custom app that we are trying to leverage some of the raw GNSS measurements to basically detect jamming and spoofing and try to provide the highest possible PNT integrity. Then I'll wrap it up with some future working conclusions. Okay, the path for GPS, GNSS integration in the mobile phone. You know, this is a great picture. I love this picture. It's from the 1980s. This is the 5-channel Rockwell Collins GPS receiver that they had. And the premise here is that GPS and now GNSS is becoming highly integrated. So if we go from that receiver, two paths really kind of remained: a low cost, lower power GPS, as well as high accuracy. And basically you think about those handheld devices in the early 2000s, as well as the survey grade equipment that came out. And that has since been refined. If you go back just a few years, you know, getting GPS into a watch was a big deal. And then, you know, smaller, more compact GNSS receivers, which do all constellations. So if you talk about where we're going today, basically even more highly integrated. This is the Broadcom BCM 47765 part. Second generation dual frequency GNSS. It does multi-constellations, as you see, across multiple frequencies. And this is not the only offering. Qualcomm has something, MediaTek, other companies basically designed for the mass market. But it really is a single chip, which has essentially an antenna input, an oscillator, and then you get an NMEA message out, which says, here's what your position is going to be. This is the part which has been designed into the Pixel 6, and I think it's also into the Pixel 7. I think that's true. I can't confirm that, but I think I saw that in some teardowns. But that's really what the paper was based on. And even the paper we're talking about today was based on pre-Pixel 6 kind of phones that we were talking about. But if you look at it, this is from one of the teardown sites. You can go through and say where the GPS chip is. And just comparing this back to the first GPS receiver is just truly amazing to me. One thing I always like to ask my students is, what given this receiver is a current lacking or weak link. If you think about that, I mean, I think to put this into a phone, given the density of the circuit, basically, I think really the antenna is a problem with the phone. Most of these phones have to really work hard for high sensitivity because they have such a penalty from the antenna. The ideal GNSS antenna is right-hand circular polarized. You're lucky if you get some kind of linear element in these phones and see really what happens. But it truly is an amazing achievement of engineering to get GNSS into these phones. So if we talk about PNT information from Android, why Android and raw measurements, Android really is the largest deployment of commercial GNSS receivers. And Google, being a data-centric company, has enabled these raw measurements to provide researchers tools to work with. And so you're not just getting a position solution anymore, which is great. Hey, here's a position, but you get the more tools, the Rhinex type measurements, the observables from each of the satellites. So you can work with those and see really what happens. And then research that is done with Android can be ported to other GNSS devices and platforms. And this chart truly amazed me, but if you look back since 2014, over 1 billion devices a year have been shipped out. So it definitely is by far and away the most prevalent GNSS receiver that's out there. You could talk about iPhones. I have an iPhone. I use both Android and the Apple iPhone, basically. But if you think about it from a GNSS perspective, Android is greater than 70% of the market share. So if looking at maximum impact, Apple controls both the hardware and the software in its devices. So Android is only an operating system, and anybody can build a hardware platform and slap Android on top of it. So it's a much more challenging piece for this PNT type operations is what goes forward. And really through Google enabling these raw measurements from the GNSS engine within Android, much more can be accomplished there. And one of the big pieces I'm going to talk to later on is this AGC, or automatic gain control. That is a piece of the receiver which was largely ignored by many people, but I think here at CU we really innovated that for looking at RFI and spoofing detection. So I'll get into that a little bit. One issue with the commercial market or consumer electronics is it's definitely not static. If GPS has evolved fast, consumer electronics even evolve faster. So if you look at the Android timeline, pre-Android 7, you could get your position out of your receiver. But starting with Android 7, that's where these raw measurements came out. So that was a really great contribution to the user community from Google. And they're not static. They said, okay, well, how does it work? What do we need? And they have continued to evolve Android to give more and more useful tools. They run their decimeter challenge, many different elements, which are quite powerful for the GNSS community. And we wanted to take a look at these and try to leverage these, particularly for the problem of jamming and spoofing detection. So PNT information from Android, myself being a GPS receiver, when we started working with mobile phones, it's a little bit different. And this is insightful. So I thought it'd be worth to share this. But position, navigation, and timing from the GNSS Android engine, basically timing is typically derived from the network and not from GNSS for system operations. It is available. And then position and navigation are not solely based on GNSS or GPS. If you look at the Android location, its overview, it has these 3 different components. A GPS location provider, GLP, which is really utilizes the signals from GNSS to determine a position. And it's often the most reliable absolute location provider within Android. But it also has a very powerful tool called the network location provider, which uses information from Wi-Fi access points, cell towers, to try to localize the user. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in coming slides. And then finally, what it tries to do is gives you a fused location provider, the FLP, combining both those informations. And it's supposed to give the best balance of accuracy and performance to see really what happens. And if you're developing any position-aware applications, you're recommended to use this fused location provider. And you can look at the location mode of what happens with it to see what happens when you set that up, and a typical timeline for how it works. And if you look at the GLP and FLP, those are 1 Hertz measurements. You're guaranteed to get those at 1 Hertz. If you look at this network location provider, because of what's involved, it's typically less than 1 Hertz. 0.2 to 0.1 Hertz is usually what people see in that kind of situation. So if you're not familiar with that network location provider, it really is a data-driven and machine learning kind of approach as to what happens. But you can imagine Apple, Google, other entities that can collect user cell phone data, and they can anonymize that and say, okay, here's what the position is, here's what cell towers I see, and here's the strength from those cell towers. You can create this ever-evolving database of different cell towers, their locations, their power levels, and you can do the same thing with Wi-Fi access points. So by looking at these and knowing users' position, they can create a database of these. So if there is no user position, you can cross-reference, hey, what cell towers do I see? What Wi-Fi access points do I see? Where have users seen these same power levels previously? And try to localize what the position is going to be. So that's kind of a general statement. There's all kinds of interesting elements you can talk about here, but just to give a high level view of how it works. If you are going to do network positioning, density matters. So if I can see one cell tower and no Wi-Fi access points, you can imagine how accurate I can get my position solution. But in urban areas where GNSS can be problematic, there's typically a high density of these access points. And then also this network location provider enables coarse positioning even when GNSS is not available. Again, it requires network and Wi-Fi access, so you have to have some kind of network or Wi-Fi access points if you want to use that. And in many situations when people are using GNSS, this is not an option. But if you do have it, it's kind of the ultimate combination. And really what I'm showing is a picture of the density of Wi-Fi access points in Boulder, Colorado over the last 10 years. There's all kind of great open source tools you can get to play with these and even do localization with some of these pieces. I mentioned even when you have no GPS, your network location provider will give you a position. This is a test we did in the basement of our engineering building. Definitely no GPS, GNSS measurements, which are coming in down there. And the blue line here, we show truth. And then we show both the network location provider and the fuse location provider measurements as they come out of these two pieces. So even when you have a situation where you have no GNSS, GPS signals, where you typically need line of sight to do that, you can use a network location engine to basically go through and get a rough approximate position as to where you are. The key takeaway is that, if you talk about that fuse measurement, even though there's no GNSS, you can tell it's doing some kind of filtering between those measurements to try to give you a 1 Hertz update, which many of your position-aware apps under Android need to actually operate. You can do the same test. We did a test using Wi-Fi enabled, where we see many more access points. And then when Wi-Fi is disabled, you only see the cell towers. So again, the more dense the access points the network position can do, the better your position is going to be. And this is just kind of comparing those two. So if you have the Wi-Fi access, you have a dense network of Wi-Fi points, you're going to get a pretty decent position solution. And there's a clear drop in accuracy if you turn off your Wi-Fi. So just a simple case study to talk about some of these pieces. This is data collected well after we did the paper, but I used our Pixel 6 and went around just a neighborhood to see what would happen, just to compare some of these if you're not familiar with them. So this is scaled as a function of time. The color shows a function of time. I'm basically starting in the middle here at my house, and I go around the neighborhood, and I look at the GPS, really the GNSS location provider, the GPL solution. That's what I'm plotting right here. I can go through and zoom in on this, and it really is amazing. If you think about, the size of that phone, the antenna that's in the phone. Again, this is pretty open sky conditions. We're going by the football practice field here in Boulder, but you can see these small deviations I take as I go through. Now, if we compare that to the network location provider, again, this is my 1 Hertz GPS GLP provider. My network position solutions are not as great. But if you had no GNSS, this is a pretty good depiction of where I'm at. Sometimes it jumps off to different locations, but it works pretty well. And then if you looked at the fuse location, you can see both. This is really the recommended measurement comes from GNSS. And if you look at, I put all three on there, actually the GLP tends to be better than the fuse because the network location can pull this off a little bit, but you can see by looking at this, they heavily weight the GLP basically getting that position solution. And you can do a small zoom to see really what happens here. So I definitely was going on the sidewalk where the fuse will take me off because of some of these measurements coming off to the side right there. So a little background on getting a PNT type solution in a phone. So let's talk about the problem. And if we think about the problem, it really comes down to the critical nature of GPS and the idea of interference and spoofing. So I think this audience probably is well aware of GPS being a component in our critical infrastructure across the world. So many different articles have come out. I could spend the whole time talking about these articles, but this one from Scientific America is a impressive title. GPS is easy to hack. US has no backup. And Homeland Security has recognized this and talk about, how important it is and what we have to do. I think everyone realizes that GNSS receivers are susceptible to RFI. It's a very weak signal coming from space. It's below the thermal noise floor. And you can think about jamming, which is the addition of noise into the band. So it increases that denominator in the signal to noise ratio. So the noise gets too strong. And spoofing, a lot of work has been done recently with spoofing. The problem with spoofing, but basically that's getting false signals into your receiver. So your receiver locks onto a signal. So I'm happy, I'm getting a position, but it's actually someone giving you a false signal with the spoofing piece. So jamming, of course, reduces the strength of GNSS signals, makes them unusable, and you need to revert to other PNT sources. The network positioning would work. You can talk about inertial devices. But there are various noise sources out there, computer hard drives, jammers. I mean, if I'm working on, and I put my antenna close to a computer, I get interference from my computer. The received signal power is below that in the thermal noise floor for GPS. So it's incredibly susceptible to jamming. And then spoofing, the position and timing of GNSS receivers can be manipulated. So jamming is somewhat mitigated by the network position of mobile phones, if you have that available to you. Defense against spoofing is more limited. So you can talk about GPS jammers. Of course, it's an illegal activity. You cannot have a jammer. They're illegal to buy, much less plug in, but the enforcement is incredibly difficult to see really what happens. So motivation for spoofing, I mean, why do you want to tell a receiver or give a receiver a false position? It's definitely an illegal activity, but it started innocently enough with gamers. The Pokemon Go, this is the old Hackaday they could put together, where they basically spoof Pokemon Go to see really what would happen with this. Just people playing games like, hey, this is what we could do. Of course, it's a legal activity. You can't do those kind of pieces. But there's also been public exposure demonstrations of GNSS spoofing. I think this was pioneered a lot by Todd Humphreys and some of his work basically back in 2013. But they did both that and then a yacht. But there's been other reported incidents of spoofing across the globe, basically, to see really what happens. And it's not overly difficult any longer to do spoofing, to see really what happens. So some of the resources were right there. If you talk about how this can impact Android devices, because rideshare platforms such as Uber and Lyft provide a profitable use case for location spoofing. Driver can use a spoof location to appear as if they're waiting at a hotspot before they're even there, securing the rider ahead of other drivers who are using their real locations. Also, drivers can report a longer route than actually driven, inflating the cost of the ride. So there's different spoofing attacks that really have happened, and the case is really there. So you can see really, it can be a problem, particularly if you want to provide the highest integrity PNT information in the most prevalent platform in the world, the Android operating system, across these variety of devices. So that's kind of the background. And what we did is, okay, let's take a look. Is this really a problem? And this is where some of our work had started. And we were looking at previous to this. But back right before the pandemic, December 2019, I went over to German Space Agency, German DLR, because some of this testing is very, very difficult. You're not allowed to turn on a jammer, you're not allowed to turn on a spoofer. So I've often worked with some of our DoD, Homeland Security type entities to work with this in the US. Also work with international entities, which have different rules for what happens. But this was conducted in 2019, and we really wanted to look at the fuse position location for multiple mobile phones using only false GPS L1 signals. So even back in 2019, many of the phones use multi-constellation, some use multi-frequency, some of those were just coming on the market right there. And in this picture, you can show really what was going on. In this, where I say spoofer, it was a re-radiator in the lab, so broadcasting rooftop signals into these phones. And then coupled into this antenna was also false GPS signals, which could lift away and carry the GPS L1 signal. So we wanted to go through and do that, and we said, okay, we're going to be static in the lab, but we have this pre-recorded spoofer pattern, which will take us from the lab at DLR and go around for a few kilometers and come back to the lab. What will happen with this piece? All phones, including the iPhone, basically, which we tested back in 2019 in December, followed this false GPS signal despite a true network solution remaining incorrect. So we were down here, right where the X is, or the round circle, that's our truth position. Every phone reported a network position which stayed right there, but the fuse location engine, as well as the NMEA message, followed that false signal for all phones we tested. It's like, okay, this is a real problem. What can we do about it? What's going to happen with it? We did some additional testing in 2021 with even modern phones, and it continued to show this problematic performance. Things had improved, but they still tended to follow false signals. So what can we do about this? This is where we get into the concept of GNSSAlarm. It's really a custom app my students have put together, kind of using some of these tests we've talked about, as well as a couple others we'll talk about, to try to give some higher integrity, leveraging those measurements Google has made available. This really came out of the work that was initiated by Damian Morales, basically, a PhD student in my lab. Same kind of thing. He wanted to come up with an app that says, hey, how do we provide this integrity into the PNT engine and what happens? Android 7 really, with the raw GNSS measurements, gives those devices. So we tried to put together this app to see what happens. And that's really what the focus of the paper was and some of our experience. I don't think it's overly complicated. This is a graphical interface which shows various indicators we're using to see if signals are being spoofed or jammed. We have a detailed logger. That was one of the biggest hassles, to come up with a really robust logger so we can kind of post-process, analyze these pieces. And we continue to do this logging in different environments to see what happens, to try to help refine and develop the app. So what I'll talk about here are just the different checks or tests that we do to see if we can trust the PNT information. So first one is GNSS versus network location. I talked a lot about network location before. It's the ability to check both the network signal as the GNSS signal and we decide which is true. But these have to be used in combination, because as I showed, the network solution with our DLR test was correct, but the GNSS solution was off. So you have to have a way to say which one is correct, or just at least flag that for the user. You get some differentiation. Again, this requires network connectivity. It only works if you have a cellular or Wi-Fi connectivity while you're doing this, because it has to talk back to the servers, report the radios that it sees, the power levels that it sees, and then the server can reply back with a network position solution. Recall, it's much more accurate if Wi-Fi is enabled. So the takeaway is it requires network connectivity to basically do this check. And then if I want to have a threshold, well, how far away between those two positions is too far? It's really location dependent. It's going to be based on the number of radios you observe, how many cell towers, how many Wi-Fi access points do you see? So it's difficult to come up with a universal threshold without taking into account those elements. But it can be a very powerful test to check those two, and it would correct the problem that we saw when we did the testing at DLR. Another test, Google has included this idea of a mock location. If I'm an application developer, I can put in a false location. I can just flag this, and it flags very quickly, hey, a mock location. But some apps, when we tested this back before we did the paper in 2019, I was amazed they were not checking if the location reported by the operating system was false or known to be a false location. We tested with the Uber app, basically, and we put a mock location, fake GPS free. And many apps are not checking for mock location. Very simple. This is done in the user interface space. So it's just a very quick check that someone should do to make sure there's not another app that's falsifying your position. Another piece you can do, if you look at time. Time is always another piece. It can't be very accurate. Of course, GNSS provides time accuracies down to tens of nanoseconds. But if I can look at my timestamped NMEA messages that are coming in and compare my system time to my GNSS time, it just gives a fairly coarse, you can see a histogram of the measurements we have below, but you're talking better than 100 milliseconds to see really what happens. So if you wanted to be spoofed and your time offset is more than 100 milliseconds, it's a pretty clear indicator that something's going on. So those are three of the kind of, I think, fundamental, pretty basic tests. And really the one I'm going to focus on, spend a little bit more time on, is this idea of automatic gain control. Because that's something we have worked with a lot. It really, so I'll talk about it a little bit. It really measures the noise floor of the antenna receiver, its signal captured in the ADC. And if you think about GPS, I have a nice little frequency domain depiction I always use down here at the bottom. The received signal power with most antennas, unless you have a super high gain antenna, is below the thermal noise floor. So this AGC is really driven by thermal noise in the phone. So any additional energy RFI or spoofing is going to increase that noise floor and result in an AGC change. It's a very low computational metric. It's available on any multi-bit GPS GNSS receiver, and it's independent of GNSS measurements. This is really just a power measurement. Hey, how much power do I see coming in? I don't have to see any satellites. I can just tell you how much power I see coming in. And really the AGC is to minimize the losses of the ADC when you do your sampling process. So this is a common component in all GNSS receivers. We've talked about this in our research papers for the last 10, 15 years. Many receiver manufacturers have adopted this. Google has incorporated the AGC into its raw measurements starting in Android 7 and are continuing to refine it. But I think it's just a very powerful technique that is readily available. So just a simple demonstration. This is some other work that we have published from a 2012 Spoofer experiment. This was a test we conducted in Sweden with the Swedish military, basically. And it's a very simple meakening experiment, basically, where they have a source antenna and then are rebroadcasting that source antenna to a wide range of areas. And we started at the bottom of a hill and we drove up a hill towards this repeater antenna. So this is some of the equipment we had in the car, some commercial receivers, some raw data loggers that we have always used before. We calibrated how much AGC we were doing with this, installed it all in the vehicle. This is the transmission antenna. So it's a fairly directive antenna broadcasting the repeat of this position down the hill. And then we had to deal with all the wildlife in Sweden, basically, we were coming through. So if you look at the results of our commercial GPS receiver as we drove up towards it, this is our change in X, change in Y, change in Z. We're static at the beginning. We kind of start going. We're going up the hill. We're up in here. We kind of lose our position. And then boom, we jump to a static location, even though the entire duration here we were driving. So you think about, okay, what's missing? What happened in this case? If you look at the AGC over that period, the AGC in this case basically shows how much power is coming in. When the AGC goes down, that means additional power is coming in. So we can set easily a threshold here. This is not a traditional observable. We pull this out of the receiver at the time. But if you could observe this right here, as soon as this would cross this threshold, you could say, well, I can't trust my signal anymore. More energy than nominal is coming in. And of course, that's what's happening. So this is driving towards the spoofer. Let's say we start at the top of the hill and we drive back away from the spoofer. What do these plots really look like? So now I'm at the top of the hill, I'm driving away. My receiver is telling me my position's not changing. I can look out the window and see the landscape change as I drive on. Eventually, as I get far enough away, I lose the capture of that meakening spoofer, and my receiver reports my true position. But the whole time here, my receiver is happy and say, okay, here's what your position is going to be. And if I look at that AGC metric, I can use that leverage very easily to say, can I trust my GNSS signal or can I not trust my GNSS signal? This is why I think it's such a powerful metric. And again, very happy to see Google incorporating that in their receiver. So we talk about AGC on Android. Automatic gain control indicates the level of the noise floor. Any extra power observed by the front end should result in a decrease in AGC, whether it's interference or spoofing. So it's a great detector. There's a test of an Android device over time. It was going static. We introduced a wideband interference source across L1. And you can see the AGC change. It gives individual AGCs for all the bands. This is from our Android device at 1 Hertz measurements. In Android devices, each constellation band has an independent AGC level. So it's looking at the noise for each of those. So that's great. I can distinguish between L1 and L5, which is awesome. In this case, it even reports different AGCs for GPS L1 and Galileo L1. So perhaps it takes into account the wider bandwidth of, it all depends on what the manufacturer's done. My suspicion is Galileo L1 and GPS L1 would be the same because they're sitting both at 1575, but perhaps they're using more bandwidth for the Galileo signal, so they incorporate that and give a different AGC metric. So it enables a user to distinguish between interference and attenuation. And this is a big one for phones. So if you think about a phone is not your static survey grade antenna mounted on the roof, but a phone can go inside, outside. And if you're curious, as looking purely blindfolds on, basically only looking at the GNSS information, if it goes away, I can't tell if my signal has gone away because I'm being jammed, or I just went to a basement, I can't see that. But if I can look at my AGC information with that, or my CDAT knots, if my AGC doesn't change, I'm being attenuated. I can't receive that GPS signal. if I see my AGC change, most likely my noise floor has changed and I'm being jammed. And what's even more powerful from this, if I collect this data from multiple users, see how much power is coming in, and users that are closer to the emitter will see more power coming in, users which are farther will see less power coming in, I can actually use a collection of devices to go through and localize the source of that spoofing. So it's great to have this information. So what's the problem with it? The measurement has been inconsistent across Android devices. Again, it was added in, I think, 2007, or with Android 7, which is 2016, I believe. Not all devices, not Android devices, provide the latest and all raw measurements. So you're limited to whatever device platform has decided to give in terms of those raw measurements. So what I have here are 5 different we test in the paper. And again, we don't try to test different phones, but we have to dig and kind of peel off the layers to see what the GNSS chipset is inside of there. But these are 2 different Broadcom chipsets, a Qualcomm chipset, a Huawei chipset, and a MediaTek chipset. And again, these were the latest, greatest at the time we did the testing. So if we talk about them, some devices report AGC on a relative scale that resets the baseline AGC value periodically. So that's the worst, because we're really looking for an absolute power measurement. That's what AGC tells us. But in implementing some of these, some people say, well, usually you want to see a 0 dB. So we're going to give you a 0 dB. And oh, it changed from 0 dB to 5 dB. Okay, that changed. That's all right. Well, now it's a 5 dB. Well, you don't want to see 5 dB. We're going to set that back to 0. So more of a relative scale that was problematic if you're trying to do this absolute power measure. Some devices reported an inverse scale. So basically, increased RFI led to increased AGC. And that's just how you scale the metric. When I say when more power comes in, AGC goes down, that has just been the industry notation ever since I started looking at receivers and what happens. You're really talking about what the amplifier in your RF chain is doing. So it's just how you report that. But you should have a consistent nomenclature for how that's reported. And a big problem is the way that this was implemented first is AGC was unavailable when GNSS signals, when there's no GNSS measurements. So it's great because when I'm outside, I'm getting my GNSS measurements, just coming over the raw measurements for GPS. That's great because I can see what my power level is. However, my AGC is always available. Even if there's no GPS signals, I can still get an AGC measurement, but I can only get it with the initial version when I had a GPS measurement. So that was true across all the chipsets. And a couple of quantization issues we had with some of the initial versions. But we talk with Google, we report these to Google, report these to the community through Institute of Navigation, and try to give guidance for future versions of Android so we can kind of continue to push for the most robust, highest integrity PNT version within Android as possible. And it's been great. So if you look at what happened in Android 13, this absence of GNSS signals, Android 13 just released, we have yet to test, but it has this extended AGC information. The class that contains the AGC information is now separate from the raw GNSS class. And we had some discussion with them. I guess it depends on the manufacturers, but that is really something which will be a big help for what we're trying to do. And my last slide on AGC, if you just look at AGC, hey, that's great. You can see how much power is coming in. But if you say, well, I want to distinguish between jamming and spoofing, you can look at both AGC and C not. And this was a great observation by a student I had in my lab, Esteban, who went through and said, you know, this is really powerful combination. We really basically go through and do that. But AGC really tells how much power is coming in. So if I have any more power coming in, you're thinking about your signal to noise ratio, any more power coming in is basically going to increase the denominator there, the noise, basically, either interference or noise. So interference will lower the carrier noise ratio density because it increases this denominator, while a spoof signal increases both the C because it's giving you a false signal as well as the noise. So by looking at the combination of those two, it becomes a powerful tool with the trend below. So if I have my AGC, and basically I look at what happens when my AGC changes, but my C not stays constant, that's a spoofing trend. Hey, I see a lot more power coming in, but I'm not seeing any change in my C not, very suspicious of spoofing. If I see my C not change dramatically, but my AGC hasn't changed, I go from outside to the basement. Well, I've attenuated those signals. I decrease my signal power. Those are now being attenuated. Okay, I'm being attenuated. I can see really what that is. And if I basically see more power coming in and my AGC and C not both, and my AGC and my C not both change, that's going to be jamming interference. So where you draw these thresholds has yet to be determined. It's device dependent, but it's a great tool to go through and detect the difference between spoofing, jamming, and attenuation. So the initial, what we put together is a very simple app. We ran on a couple of different devices. We give the position information from Android. We show the network only location, the GNSS only location, as well as the fuse location. We put our flags we talked about in here. What's the delta position between network position and GNSS? The Mach position indicator, which is so simple, you just check one flag in the operating system. Time indicator, how much time difference do we see? And then we have our AGC indicators for the different plans that come across. And people always want a very easy user. Hey, am I okay? Everything's green. Or things go bad, it turns red. So that's basically what we have kind of put together. Future work conclusions, trying to wrap things up. So one of the big things we found is we have to continue to test and assess the latest GNSS chipsets as to their performance for high integrity applications. To attempt to generalize GNSS alarm across devices and platforms, when we first came in, hey, can I try it? Well, what kind of phone do you have? Okay, what platform's in it? Even if you talk about a Samsung S20, the S20 has so many different components under the hood. Some are Qualcomm, some are Broadcom. So it really depends. And we have to really look at that GNSS chipset and how it responds to different things. So that's one of the things we are continuing to look at. And it's great that the manufacturers have recognized some of these and are incorporating some of these tools within the chipset. So this is a very evolving platform. The other piece that's great about these phones is, wow, they have a great set of sensors, inertial sensors, the XLs, the gyros, the mag, the baro. Those can be used in combination. They're fairly low quality, but you can use those for some of the course checks to see really what happens with that piece. All the algorithms we're doing on Android can be exported to other GNSS receivers and platforms. And we want to use the vast network of Android devices. This is a pretty powerful tool. If we can get this app installed across many different devices to do the localization, the power difference of arrival. It was truly feasible with the introduction of AGC in Android 7, 2016. I think Logan Scott made the case for, even more than 10 years ago. And I think looking at the CDNNOT, but with combination of CDNNOT and AGC, we kind of did some testing with that. We published in 2018. So yeah, it's going to work basically. It's just a matter of getting the right phones. Harder to do across a collection of phones. I have one phone and it's a cherry picked phone is what? It works really well. But trying to make that general is really the kind of key piece. So summary and conclusions, wrapping things up. I think GNSS, everybody recognizes as part of the critical infrastructure across all aspects of society across the world. Same time, it still remains vulnerable to interference and spoofing, despite legal measures. Android is the most prevalent GPS, GNSS receiver in the world. Those chipsets are truly amazing. I wish I could get Qualcomm, MediaTek, Broadcom, just to give me a development kit and put a real antenna to it, because you could do so much with it. I mean, they're just dealing with high volumes. So, trying to maximize and make that as the highest robustness, the highest integrity is great. And then you got to give Google a lot of credit for making those raw measurements available. I mean, we can do so much with those right now. The decimeter challenge, we've kind of focused on the high integrity. So really what can happen. So we're continuing our research to exploit methodologies to continue the robust GPS, GNSS, PNT operations. So I appreciate your interest. Hopefully it was informative. That's all my canned material. So I'm happy to entertain questions, whatever is best for the group.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. This has been really interesting. If you have a question for Dennis, please use the Q&A button in your viewer. You can click on that and enter your questions there. Let's see, open the window up. We'll get it ready here for you.
No, I guess I should look at the chat, basically.
Now, Dennis, one question I had as you were going through your presentation, you mentioned in an earlier slide that in 2021, you retested the difference between the FLP and NLP, and you said it had improved in 2021. I was just curious what had changed or what improvements you noted.
Let me pull this up here for a second. So I guess they were two very different tests. The first one we did with the German DLR test. The second test was part of an exercise conducted with a government entity, and we were using different phones. It was 2 years apart, and things changed very dramatically. So the responses we had more capable phones that were there, and the same scenarios that we saw in 2019 that were problematic were not problematic. We're not all problematic in 2021. So it really, without getting into too many of the details, because some of the sensitivities, it really depends on kind of the scenarios which are constructed, particularly for the false signals, to see really what happens with that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thanks. We have a question from Logan Scott. He said, I guess he was asking, he said, what are the effects on mobile phone power consumption?
You know, I mean, I think one of the, it's always been one of the power drainers when you run the GNSS in the phone. That has gotten better over time, but when you first did it, I think that took an awful lot of time. Since we're not doing anything special at this time, other than looking at the raw measurements which are coming in, AGC is a low computational complexity metric. It's just coming across. You don't have to do much manipulation or calculations with it. I think it's pretty minimal. So I think it's a very small delta above running normal PNT operations under Android.
Okay. Another question from Luther Nguyen. He said, thank you for sharing. In short, does this mean that AGC is the best possible way to detect jamming in a mobile device?
I'm a little biased, you know, and I think it really depends on, so AGC is just, again, it stands for automatic gain control. It's required in any multi-bit ADC to try to optimize that gain. But that said, I'm using the term AGC as a blanket term for any number of different implementations that could be done. So for example, if you look at a U-block receiver, which is a great low-cost receiver, it has a fairly coarse AGC reporting on the order of 3 dB. Some of my early tests with the Android devices, they are much better than that, on the order of a dB or 2. And there's some commercial survey grade receivers which have better than a dB of AGC. Just depends on what the level of measurement you have to do, but there's also temperature effects, everything else. So there are elements that have to be calibrated out, but I think for spoofing, particularly if I'm using a mobile device where I don't know the orientation pattern of my antenna, it's very difficult to just give me a little bit more power to try to capture my receiver, just because I could be dynamic, everything else. So I have to give it a significant more power. And in that case, most of, I think the AGC will work quite well. Of course, if I have inertial sensors, I have multiple antennas, you know, there's been great papers on different spoofing, jamming detection techniques. I just think it happens to be a fairly low cost, efficient one that is in all receivers. So we try to leverage it extensively, but it definitely are many other approaches that could be done to do spoofing type detection.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question from Raj who says, can you please suggest some applications to investigate raw Android measurements?
Well, I think the Google logger, Google's done a great job. I can't sing their praises enough for what they have done. But if you look at some of the open source tools they have published to pull those in, that's really the basis for all the work that we have done. Basically bringing those in, and then if I go back to that particular slide that I had about the Android timeline, I think those tools are really the best. Working with Android Studio and bringing those tools and adapting those really are some of the easiest, best things that's the way we started. So I think that's the best way to get going with it.
Sure. And you can even look at some of the results and papers submitted to the Google Decimeter Challenge sponsored by ION. You see a lot of creative uses of that data there, right?
Absolutely. No, for sure. I mean, you'll see, so the Decimeter Challenge is really Google ION's work to try to get the highest possible accuracy. And people have done amazing things with that raw data. And, you know, so that logger and how you process that is really, that's an outstanding tool to get started with.
Yeah. Let's see. Question from Michael. It says, is there a good way to select thresholds for comparing the C to N naught changes versus attenuation patterns to discern spoofing or jamming?
That's an excellent question. And again, that's where it gets complicated because it gets very device specific as to what you see and, you know, how fine of resolution you see with the AGC and kind of, you know, how broadband that is. So I think that is one of the pieces. I think it's a great question because that's one of the pieces we struggle with, because even if I have two different models of the same phone, it depends on how tight I want to set those thresholds, but it's best if it's calibrated on an individual by individual phone basis, which is not practical. So then you have to inflate your thresholds for basically see what you could do there. So that's one of the works we're trying to do. And again, I think through Google's efforts to try to standardize some of these pieces, that should get better in the future, but that has been a real challenge thus far.
Okay, I guess that kind of goes along with Christian's question here, was asking if this app would be available publicly, or does it just need so much tuning for each different vendor, chipset, and handset?
we've kept it in the lab a little bit. We've had that question before and trying to see what that makes sense. The problem is, as soon as we release something, well, it doesn't work here. What's wrong with that? And we've entertained all those questions. So until we can generalize it a little bit better and kind of feel more comfortable with things, I think it's important that we kind of just we'll publish all the papers that we have continued to do within student navigation, because I think that's the best way to get it out. But I think the flurry of questions as to why does it work here, why doesn't it work here, I think it's easier for publish the papers and let people tinker with those ideas the best they can.
Sure. A question from Carl, who asks, how capable are spoofers? And I guess what's the potential for a spoofer of countering the AGC measurements? Is there a chance they could adjust, I guess, transmit power or gain somehow so that it doesn't show?
No, I think that, that's a very good question as well. And, there's all kind of literature that's been published out of my lab and out of other labs as well. I think that what a spoofer will try to do, if you want to defeat the AGC, is you want to put, if this is my nominal power level, I just want to put in a tiny bit above so I can kind of capture a receiver, but without detecting that additional power coming in. And I think I think the most challenging piece would be if I had a rooftop install and I could approach that antenna with a re-radiator or something else like that and get very, very close to it. I could try to inject that power just so it was slightly above. And again, it depends on my sensitivity, my AGC, how well can I detect the additional power coming in. But I think for most practical applications, if I have a dynamic system with an antenna pattern which is moving and changing, in order to ensure you capture that receiver, you have to put out considerable power levels, and that should be detectable. But I think it's a great question, and it kind of is that middle ground where I drew that line is, is this spoofing or is this not spoofing? It's really based on how much power is coming in. So I think the most susceptible would be static receivers, where a little bit of power could try to come in, and that gets to be more problematic.
Okay. Another question here says, referring to INS measurements, could the differences between INS positioning and data and the other navigation data from the phone be used to detect spoofing within a smartphone?
No, absolutely. I think that, if you look at the additional sensors in there, that's great. The problem is we don't have a tactical grade INS in a phone. It's a very low cost. It's even not automotive grade INS in a phone. So if you're looking for those changes, they have to be fairly gross as to what's happening. So, it depends on my deviations between what my GNS or my false signals reporting and what all the inertial sensors, my mag, my baro, accels, gyros are reporting. You just have to recognize the quality of those, and those are always improving. Those are going to get better and better, but those are difficult to use for positioning. I think if you talk about the decimeter challenge, folks initially started looking at that, and Google includes those, but I think that the quality of measurements make it difficult to really get very high accuracy position domain capabilities. But if you're looking for gross different, am I moving, am I not moving, you should be able to see those kind of pieces.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, like you said, maybe it's a macro level until we have quantum sensors on our phones, right?
For sure.
Let's see. Have you been able to identify, or at least roughly, the location of an RFI source using the PDOA?
In that slide, I don't know if I'm happy to make slides available, Rick, but in that one slide, we did a paper in 2018, which talked about that, and we have. And this was taking a collection, a handful of phones, 5 to 10 phones in a controlled environment where we could turn on emitters legally and basically do this test. And we were able to basically localize it. Now, again, if you could use the public access or a subset of the public access where I could anonymize those measurements and bring those in, you get a wealth of measurements. Some people are going to be inside, some people are going to be outside, but if you can pull these all in, I think it's a really powerful technique that could be done. And we have truly demonstrated that for a collection of phones in a very static case. We just haven't extended that to the a much broader data set, a much richer data set to see how effective it would be. But I truly believe that it is possible. Okay,
great. Our next question is from Rajesh, who says, you achieved spoofing detection at the signal processing level. Is this something that could be done on the navigation solution side?
So if you think about what's going on, and it's interesting to observe. If you think about one of the first tests we did with the DLR side, those were only measurements, the false measurements were only on the GPS L1 signal. And that was a multi-constellation. Most of those phones were multi-constellation, a couple even multi-frequency. So the question really comes in when such RF energy goes into the antenna and into the chipset, how the chipset decides to act on that information. So GPS has been historically the gold standard in PNT. GLONASS tends to run off. Galileo has a couple incidents. So the question is, if I am the engineer at Broadcom, Qualcomm, MediaTek, and I see some difference in there, the question goes to really, what do I want to trust? Because I have to give you a final position solution, and I want that to be the best I possibly can. So that was my assumption as to why GPS L1 was so impactful. With the raw measurements, I get my pseudo ranges from GPS, from Galileo, from GLONASS. So at the navigation solution level, I can compute those. That takes more power because I'm going to have to bring that in. I have to do the least squares. If I really want to do it well, I have to do a Kalman filter so I can get the very outstanding accuracy that the cell phone chipset manufacturers have already achieved. If you just do a least squares accuracy, and the Google tools provide that for you, the accuracy is very poor. So you have to really look at that hard, but there is a capability to look at that. It depends on what signals are false. And if someone gives you all false signals, well, hey, I know you're listening to GPS, Galileo, and GLONASS, I'm going to make those all be false, then you can't do anything with the navigation domain.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. Okay, we have a question from Andres who says, is there a big difference in terms of anti-jamming and anti-spoofing capabilities between the GNSS chipsets from the major manufacturers like Broadcom or Qualcomm and other chipsets for general GNSS applications like the Mosaic from Septentrio or the ZF9P module from U-Blox?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. If I would classify the different devices, if I think about the phones, and again, I'm by no means an industry or commercial, know all the pieces across the commercial spectrum. But I mean, the big players, I think, in the GNSS chipsets are probably Broadcom, Qualcomm, MediaTek, and Huawei. And they all have their pros and cons, which we talk about in the paper. And I try to show in that table is what happens. But that's just one snapshot in time. And I think that's evolving. And, our work continues to test those different ones. So it's really not platform. And even once you put one of those devices inside a phone, hey, what antenna did you pair with it? How does it work? And what other components does it see? So it's hard to say, is there a big difference? I would say there's probably not, there's pros and cons. I'm not sure I would say a big difference. If you go to the next step up, which are kind of the Mosaic or the U-Blox chipsets, they have their pros and cons. Those basically offer, in addition to AGC, they offer a frequency spectrum plot, which is great because you can see if energy is coming in. I can just see more power is coming in, but I can't see any kind of frequency information there. So those can be quite powerful as well. But they're also more money, but they're targeted for different uses. If you go high up the chain to the Septentrio, Trimble's, Novatel's, they offer a lot of features right now, which are great, kind of building on some of these premises. So I think it's hard to say, is there a big difference? I think you do definitely get more when you pay more money, but what these chipsets are capable and what they sell them for in volume, and we can exploit a lot of those features that are possible in the more expensive components in Android.
Great. Okay, thanks. Another question here says, have you done any tests trying to classify the type of jamming using the raw measurements on the Android device?
So I think that can be challenging. So we've done that, but not so much with Android. But if you have, so Android gives our AGC, which is again one of my favorite measurements to use. But I have no depiction of the frequency span of what's happening over that. So again, if I go a step up to the U-Blox, Mosaic, Trimble, all those receivers, they usually give some frequency content as well. So that can be quite helpful. But even that is still limiting. And if you really want to do some characterization, hey, this is this spoofer, this is this jammer. What I really like to do is use some of the raw data collections, whether it be the USRPs, the Blade RFs, the Hack RFs, to go through and kind of capture that. And what you can do is you can use, typically not Android devices, but we use other more installed receivers to trigger those because those generate such high data volumes. You can trigger those and then you have a full capability as to what goes on and what that looks like.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for your time today, Dennis. This has been really interesting and relevant to so much of the development going on in our industry. So we really appreciate your time. And again, this paper is available for download from our website at navi.ion.org. You can get the full technical paper there. We'll also have a recording of this webinar along with slides posted on ion.org probably by tomorrow. So Dennis, thanks again.
No, that's great, Rick. Thanks for everybody for their interest, everything else. Great questions. Please feel free to follow up by email if you have any more. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.